Lord my God.
Good to see everybody this morning. Grab your Bibles, open it to the book of Job, Job chapter 1. I obviously am not going to do an extensive, exhaustive study of Job, right? I've got a short little lesson just using him within the theme of what we've been doing here as we've been talking about gather your own straw, right, with those Israelites. And when they were in Egypt, we talked about Noah having to gather his own wood and do the work that was necessary to prepare the ark to the saving of his self and his family. Switching gears a little bit now, maybe making it a little more practical to us, because the truth is nobody in here is going to be building an ark, most likely. And none of us are most likely going to be gathering literal stubble for straw in order to build bricks for an Egyptian pharaoh. But we've gained the lessons that we can from those examples, but I want to turn that a little bit to more of character issues now. How do we build the right character in order to serve God? How do we gather integrity when we need to in order to maintain our faith and our convictions? How do we gather those personal character traits in order for us to be able to live and behave as God would have us to? So that's kind of where we're going to turn our attentions to today and over the next 3 lessons that wrap up this series of studies over the next few weeks. But before I get back into our discussion, if you would, let's bow our heads together and share in a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for this day. Thank you for the blessings of life that you bestow upon us on a daily basis. Again, thank you for this opportunity that we have to gather at this place, to open up your word, to learn from your examples and teachings. And particularly today, Father, give us a heart that's receptive to who Job was and the integrity of his faith and convictions in you prior to the challenges that came to him. Help us appreciate the example that he set and the lessons that we can learn. Guide us in our study today, and we pray all these things through thy Son's name. Amen. So, I want you to think just for a minute with me, and I wrote it into the outlines, and again, I'm just showing you on the screen a blown-up version of what you have in your hands in terms of the lesson sheets. But when we think of Job, we usually think of what character about him. He was what? He's patient, right? And that's fair, by the way. I'm not arguing that isn't right, that Job somehow wasn't patient and is an example of that. But his ability to be patient had more to do with who he was before the problems came, right? His need to be patient came after he had developed the kind of integrity of faith that was necessary to be able to withstand those kinds of challenges. And the point I'm trying to make in this particular lesson is if you got to gather your integrity of faith before the problems come, right? Noah had to gather the wood before he could build the ark. The Israelites had to gather the straw before they could make the bricks so that they could satisfy the Pharaoh, so that they could continue to sustain themselves. There was work that needed to be done in order to fulfill the purpose or things that were in front of them. Job's ability to be patient had to do with what he was before he needed to be patient. You and I will struggle if we're trying to develop patience in the midst of the trial. So think about that with me for a minute. If we wait for the problems to arrive, if we wait for the moment where I need the patience to develop the kind of character necessary to sustain those moments, I'm going to be in trouble. Generally, when I've lost my patience in particular circumstances, it's because I didn't prepare myself to address the problem that was coming. I hadn't built the right kind of mindset, the right kind of integrity of faith, or whatever it might be that was necessary to be able to overcome that. Notice I said in the material, yet his patience is a result of a greater aspect of his character. Without the integrity of his faith in God, I imagine, and these are my words, by the way, finally you're getting material I actually wrote instead of somebody else's stuff, but I imagine his patience may have been challenged if he hadn't built that integrity first. A valued lesson we should appreciate from Job is the need to develop integrity before the difficulties arrive. He was given every reason to abandon his faith, right? Isn't that really what all Satan's trying to do? Remember, the conversation that God has with Satan is basically, listen, Satan thinks he's got everybody, and God says what? Have you considered my servant Job? You think you got everybody, Satan, but have you considered my servant Job? And then Satan does everything he can to get Job to abandon that integrity of faith, and he uses some pretty serious things in order to accomplish that, by the way. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move through our study. He was given every reason to abandon his faith, yet because he gathered his own integrity before the calamities arrived, he was able to withstand Satan's aggression. Again, Job's ability to overcome those difficulties had everything to do with who he was before the problems came. And that's what we want to talk about in this particular study. And we're using basically Job 1 to do that, by the way. I realize there's a billion other things that we could use from Job chapter 2 forward in the narrative. I get it. But for our purposes, I'm just focusing on chapter 1 to get the message and the lesson that we're trying to appreciate within discussion. So the first thing I asked was, how is Job described in Job chapter 1, verse 1 and in verse 8? So how's he described there? Okay, words like blameless and upright. What other kinds of descriptions are used? Okay, feared God, man of faith, eschewed evil, right? That's a great, pause for thought, right? Here's a man who built an integrity of faith, was upright, was blameless or perfect, feared God, and wanted nothing to do with evil. That's important, by the way, isn't it? Because he's going to be challenged to respond with evil. When evil besets him, when evil arrives at his doorstep, he's going to be tempted and tried to use evil in response to that, but he eschews evil before that moment ever comes. He's determined that evil is never the right path. Wow, what an example that is for us. Evil is never the right path, never. And his integrity of faith allows him to appreciate that. That's part of his description. Anything else you noticed? Yeah, that's verse 8, right? He was exceptional in his efforts to develop this kind of faith. I didn't put it in your notes, but there's a text that Paul wrote about in the New Testament. He said, when we run the race of faith, he said, we have to run as how? As if there's only one winner, right? He's not implying that only one person is going to go to heaven. What he's trying to say is, we have to run our race of faith as if there was only one. In other words, to excel. There's a caution with that, right? We don't want to be filled with pride or self-righteousness. But there is a level here that Job strove to be exceptional in his faith. He strove not to just satisfy what people would have viewed as being a man of faith. He wasn't content with just having certain attributes that fit a description of a man of God. He wanted to excel at that. And so much so that he's described as one that was none like him. Go ahead, Amy.
I picture that too is, you can't latch yourself onto somebody else and be saved through them.
Yeah. Right, and that's the conversation we're having, right? He understood the personal accountability they had. He gathered his own integrity of faith because no one else could do that for him. No one else could provide it or give it to him. Nobody can give it to us. We've got to choose to build it and live it for ourselves and accept that personal accountability before the trials and challenges come. And then those same descriptors are given again there in verse 8 that we also saw in verse 1. That's who Job was. Never forget that, by the way. Anytime you're looking at anything else that happens to Job, don't forget who Job was before it ever happens. Before one messenger ever shows up at his door. This is who he was. And now he's going to have the challenge of having to endure and continue to be that guy in the midst of some pretty serious and sober difficulties. Your thoughts, questions? I'll pause for a second. So, question 2 then. So, according to the text, how would you describe Job's earthly existence up until this point? Okay, blessed, comfortable, wealthy. Those are all fair, by the way. godly, right? That's him as well, even in the midst of all those benefits and things that are offered unto him. Let's look at the description beginning in verse 2. So there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. So he has 10 children, right? He's blessed with 10 children. We know he feels blessed with these children. Why? Yeah, he prays for them. He's concerned about them. He wants benefit for them and favor that comes from God as it relates to them. Here's a man who recognizes that he's blessed with this wonderful family, and he's concerned about their spiritual health. His substance also was 7,000. You ever driven by a sheep farm here in West Virginia? And you're like, wow, look, there's got to be 15 sheep. 7,000. I don't even know. It's hard to even fathom what that looks like, right? To imagine looking out in some pasture field and just seeing nothing as far as the eye could see for a ways, but sheep. 7,000 sheep. But we're not done. If he just had the sheep, pretty good. But 3,000 camels.
What do you do with 3,000?
I have no idea, Bill. Right? Yeah.
But that's how wealth was measured back in those days.
That's right. Yeah, it wasn't always about gold and silver and those things that people put monetary value on. It was just as much about the flocks and the sheep, the herds, and those really were a sign or measure of a man's ability. 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, which means that's actually 1,000. All right, if at least, unless right, you could technically yoke more than 2. You could yoke maybe 4 to get right. So that's just the work power that he has available to him. 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she donkeys, and a very great household. He's got what? Servants. Okay? Only who has servants? The rich people, right? The wealthy. Okay? Verse 8 said, there is none like him on the earth. May I suggest to you that one of the ways that he is different is the wealth didn't corrupt him.
Like Abraham.
Yeah. He didn't let it corrupt who he was. And that's a rarity, right? Right, and when if you fast forward after all the to the end, God doubles the wealth that he had in response. But I'm just trying to get us to appreciate him, right? He's quite different because he doesn't follow the same path that wealth often creates in the minds of people. And he hasn't let all of that earthly benefit affect his faith and convictions in God. We're not told exactly how long it took for him to accumulate these things. We don't know much prior, right? All we kind of know is the description of him beginning in verse 1, but that was kind of the state or condition we find him in when we're first introduced to him. But imagine, though, a period of time necessary for this wealth to accumulate, and it appears in the description that at no point did it ever affect him as one who had convictions and faith and integrity in his relationship with God.
It said he offered burnt offering, I assume, for his family and his servants.
Yeah.
According to what God expected.
Right. And continued to be faithful to that in the midst of all these things, when it very easily could have him desired to just keep everything for himself. Yeah. Yeah.
And again, there's a superlative, greatest of all the men of the East.
Yeah. So,
Greatest wealth, greatest integrity.
yeah. Yeah. He is quite an interesting character. Go ahead, Amy.
And I think also this description came from God, not from other men describing him that way. And I think that's
Yeah. Yeah.
important to know.
Right. That is important because this isn't an autobiography of the life of Job, right? This isn't Job writing about himself or some friend of his. Right? This is God's assessment of him, and that is important in this conversation. So verse 4, and I want you to note that. So his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. And pause for a minute. So, as is probably common, his wealth did what? Yeah, expanded down to these children. It's trickling down. They've all got their own houses, right? They're able to conduct these feasts. They tend to invite their sisters to come when they hold these feasts. Job has some concern that though that wealth has not affected him in a negative way, that wealth may be affecting his children in a negative way. That's a man of integrity of faith who eschews evil. That's a man who doesn't just think about his own concern of his own personal integrity and at least I'm eschewing. No, here's a guy who's concerned about the fact that what he can provide for his children may affect them differently if they haven't developed the kind of integrity of faith that he has established for himself. And so it was when the days of their feasting were gone about that Job sent and sanctified them and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be. Did Job know for fact? No. Right? I think that's a false conclusion sometimes I think we make about these children. There's obviously concern here, but his concern is the possibilities of what could happen when this wealth might taint their mindsets and they might forget about God or even do what? Curse God in their hearts. So just out of the mere concern about the possibility of that, Job would offer, every time they gathered for their feasts, Job would offer burnt sacrifice on behalf of everybody that was assembled at those feasts. And he, just in case that his sons may have sinned and cursed God in their hearts during this time. Job recognized, back to an earlier point that we made, that his faith and integrity of that faith didn't necessarily just automatically pass on to his children, did it? He recognized how he might eschew evil might not be the way his children would eschew evil. He's concerned about the fact that the ability that they have to have access to the wealth that has obviously seemingly passed down from him to them, and their ability to throw these celebrations and things that they have, that they might choose differently than he would choose. And so he makes offering. And it happened last time too, didn't it? Thank you. I need to read that so I know what it's actually telling me. Oh, okay. Let me see if I can even remember how I got rid of it last time. Which is odd. It's telling me that signal isn't coming to but yet it's there. So I don't know. Anyway. So that's a concern that Job has. Yeah, this didn't stop every time. All right. Go ahead. I knew I heard a voice.
Did that do his children any good? I mean, they weren't being accountable. He was being accountable for them. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And it is, and we're dealing with different time period. We're dealing, you're dealing with the days of what? Right. Yeah, patriarchs, right? We're dealing with the time period even prior to anybody being obligated to any specific written law, right? How were they getting God's instructions up until the time of Moses? It was just coming down from the fathers, right? It was just being passed along. That's why we call it the days of the patriarchs. So what God's desire was it just being passed along by the patriarchs of the family, and so. And obviously, we know sacrifice was important in that process because that's even happening. That caused the first what? It caused the first murder, right? Because of the disagreement between the sacrifices that Cain and Abel made. So, I get it. You're right. They aren't taking seemingly any personal accountability here. But again, what I see here is not Job accusing his children of doing anything. He's such a man of God that just in case they did, he's making sacrifice on their behalf. And I think this just says more about him than it does necessarily about whether his children are accepting or not accepting. But I get it. You're right, because I've often thought the same thing. It's interesting to hear he is more concerned. Right, your mind might go there. Is he more concerned about their spiritual and integrity of faith towards God than they are? And that's possible here, and obviously a concern of his. Good, Lord.
Like us now. I mean, we are constantly praying for our children, and
Sure.
our hearts are always thinking about how they're living their lives, and we pray on their behalf. Anyways,
Yeah.
it's just basically the same thing.
Yeah, even when they're not even in your house. These children have grown up and are gone. They're out. And he's still making burnt offerings and sacrifices and appealing to the Father on their behalf just out of concern. And again, we're just building this understanding. This is who he was. Before the losses, before the heartaches, before the difficulties that are about to arrive to him, this is who he was. This is what he had gathered in terms of his own character and the integrity of that character before Satan ever arrives on the scene. So Satan's got a perception about why Job does all this. What is it? Right. So Satan and God, and that's an interesting part of this, and I didn't spend any... It's not really part of our narrative, so I didn't spend any time. But it is interesting to think about that God's having conversations, right, with Satan here. He's having this direct conversation about one of his followers and disciples, if you will. But anyway, I don't have any answers to that, by the way, except it happened. And so here's this conversation, and Satan's assessment is, he wouldn't be anything in relationship to you, God, if you hadn't blessed him every time he turns around. Sure, a guy's going to honor you and love you and follow you because every time he does anything, you just keep giving him more. And that's Satan's assessment. Look at begin in verse 9. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught or nothing? Does Job really fear you but gets nothing out of this? Hast not thou, number one, made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? That's important, by the way. Because Satan doesn't just say to God, well, you've blessed him. That's not really what he said, is it? He said, you've what? Yeah, you've protected him. You've protected what he's got. And so it's pretty easy for a guy to fear you, to love you, to honor you, to maintain his faith towards you, because nothing ever happens to him. He and even his extended household, nothing ever happens to him. That's important because what's about to occur? Everything's about to happen to him, right? Everything's about to happen to him. Satan's acknowledgement here is the only reason he honors you is because you've protected him. Nothing ever happens to him. You've blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said to Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. What's God basically say to Satan? Okay, so that's the restriction that he gives here is do what you will, only you can't harm him personally. But what's he really driving at here? Okay, the testing that Satan believes that God hasn't allowed Job to experience. Right? His integrity of faith is only there. Sure, it's easy for him to maintain it because you've never let anything happen to him.
Satan described it as you put a hedge around it. That's going to be gone.
Okay.
Everything inside of that is.
Okay. And let me go back to that. And I'm not arguing with you, although we've done that plenty over the years. But sorry, anybody at home's going, who's he talking to? It's my sister. Anyway, but just food for thought, and disagree, it's okay. Maybe God's saying, I haven't put any hedge around him. That's your assessment. You believe I have. Go do what you will. The only hedge I've put on him against you is his own person. And here's why at least I think that's worthy of thinking about for a minute. Because of God's description of Job up until this point. How does God, not some other human beings, how does God describe Job? Does he describe him as a man who's been under his protection for X amount of years, and because of that, he's been a great servant of mine? Does God describe him as one who has had all of the blessings just handed to him without any real... Just think about that. Because, and the only reason I want us to at least think about that is I never want to diminish God's assessment of who Job was and why he was that before this comes.
Now that you say that, we see Satan says, you touch him.
Yeah.
And God's like, hey, you can have power over his things.
Yeah.
So maybe that is an implication there. I didn't put anything there, so you go do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And go ahead, Amy, I'm sorry.
His description of Job has nothing to do with the things that he has or the blessings that he has. It has to do with his character towards himself.
Yeah.
He fears God. He's upright with God.
His top priority was God, even his family, everything was below that. God was
Right.
above that. He's prioritizing God,
Sure.
made him be able to live the way he lived.
Absolutely. And so that's exactly, I think, what we need to think about, right? Because Satan believes that people only will serve God so long as they receive some earthly blessing because of it. Yeah. Yeah. And Satan continually believes that. And even the account of Job doesn't change his thinking about that. Fast forward, Matthew chapter 4, Satan's tempting whom? Jesus. And he takes Jesus up and he shows him the world and says, bow down and worship me and I'll what? Give it everything. And trust me, I'm opening up a can of worms, I get it. But because I didn't give you this text in your lesson sheets, but I want you to think about it. Is it a temptation to Jesus, right? Those are temptations. if Satan doesn't have power to give it? I would argue no. I would argue that if Satan, and I get he is the father of lies, I get that, but if Satan doesn't have any ability to grant what he's offering, Jesus could just quickly dismiss that, right? He'd just quickly dismiss it. But just get your mind. So here's what I want you to think about now. And again, I'm just giving you a study, food for thought here. And the Lord said unto Satan, verse 12, I'm back in Job. And the Lord said unto Satan, behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Earthly things have always been used by Satan to try to manipulate people. They've always been something within his power to use. I'm just trying to challenge us to think a little bit here maybe about the fact that Satan's assessment of Job is a falsehood. He's not honoring, and obviously you can fast forward and know that, right? You can go ahead in the story and know this to be true. I'm just trying to get you to see it in chronology here. Satan's assessment of Job is wrong. God says you could be disrupting his earthly existence. You've got influence, right? You've got abilities to hand. And so God puts this single restriction of not touching him, because he's now kind of telling Satan, go for it, right? He's kind of telling Satan, just go ahead. And so God understands the power that Satan has and the difficulties he can create. And so, but it's fascinating, right? It's just, to me, it's just fascinating to think about who Job was, what he was about, what Satan could have been possibly doing all along, and obviously had failed. And Job's this kind of example. And just think about those things. Look at it and decide for yourself whether some of that might not be part of this conversation.
This verse, every time I read this, I always think about how God tells him, it's in your power, go ahead, mess with his stuff, but don't touch him. And Satan obeys that.
Yeah. He didn't have any choice.
He answers to him. God's
Yeah,
in
yeah.
control of the whole thing.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
he only has the power God gives him.
Right. Right. Or God lets him use. Yeah, that God lets him use. Good thought. Okay. So right, so that's come on. So that's Satan's assessment. So question 4, does Satan attempt to exploit weaknesses in our faith? So his assessment of Job is he's got some things that might weaken him. Before that bell goes off here in a second, Luke 22. Let's look at this text. I'll probably end up coming back to it, Lord willing, on Wednesday, but I want to make sure that I knew I read that backwards. Luke 22, verse 31. This is Jesus in having his conversation with Peter prior to Peter denying the Lord. And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold what? Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. I'm going to argue that's very similar to what's happening in the life of Job. Satan wanted Job. He wanted this man of faith, this man of integrity, to curse God and die. And he's got the same mindset when it comes to Peter here. Satan has desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for thee, Jesus says, that thy faith fail not, and when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. Quick side point. Isn't it interesting that Jesus prays for Peter even though he knows he's what? He's going to fail anyway. I have prayed for you that your faith won't fail. That's my longing, my hope, what I want. But in the same breath, he says what? And when thou art converted. In other words, you're going to. I place this prophecy as truth. You will deny me. I'm praying that it won't happen, but it's coming. But when you're converted, strengthen the brethren. My point, friends, is simply this. Satan wants to influence all of us away from our faith. And he'll find ways to do that. Yeah. And he'll find ways to challenge us. He'll find ways to challenge men like Peter. And he'll create difficulties for us. And we've got to be prepared and ready to maintain our integrity of faith despite those things. Yeah. Yeah. And I'll come back to that. I want to add this text with Peter and come back to it a little bit.